It is the autumn of 1917, and the Western Front is a place where noise will kill you. Not metaphorically, literally. The whistle of an incoming shell travels at roughly 340 meters per second through cold French air, and the experienced soldier, if he is lucky, if he has trained his ears to the point where the sound becomes involuntary reflex, has perhaps a second and a half to flatten himself before the earth where he was standing becomes a crater. The men who survive longest are not the strongest or the bravest. They are the ones who have learned to listen. Trench warfare by 1917 has become an auditory arms race. You listen for the distant pop of a mortar tube. You listen for the creak of wire. You listen for the particular quality of silence that means a raid is coming. Every man on the line knows that his ears may be the only thing standing between him and death, and they guard them accordingly. Which is why, in a series of quiet meetings held at the War Office in London during the latter months of that year, a proposal was put forward that must have seemed, to anyone who heard it without context, like the opening line of a particularly dark joke. A senior officer, accounts differ as to exactly who first articulated the idea formally, though the proposal bore the fingerprints of several minds simultaneously, suggested that a specialist unit be formed for a particular and extraordinarily dangerous mission. The men in this unit, it was decided, would not need to hear the enemy coming. In fact, their inability to hear would be precisely the point. The men they were looking for were deaf. Not partially deaf, not hearing impaired in the bureaucratic sense that the medical boards use to discharge otherwise useful soldiers. Profoundly, functionally, completely deaf. Men for whom the entire acoustic dimension of warfare simply did not exist. The proposal was not charity. It was not accommodation. It was tactical. Because the British Army, by 1917, had identified a problem so specific, so technically demanding, and so psychologically punishing that the men best equipped to solve it were, almost paradoxically, the ones the Army had previously considered least suited to serve at all. This is the story of what those men were asked to do, how they did it, and why their contribution to the British war effort was, for decades, one of the most quietly suppressed chapters in the history of the First World War. To understand why deaf soldiers were useful, you need to understand what was happening to the ones who could hear. By the middle years of the war, the British Army was facing a crisis that had nothing to do with shells or gas or the tactical deadlock of the trenches. It was facing a crisis of human perception. The specific problem was this. In the artillery observation and forward listening post roles that were by 1916 considered essential to effective counter-battery work, the men being assigned to these positions were burning out at a rate that the medical establishment had no useful framework to describe. The term shell shock was by then familiar, but what was happening to these men was something slightly different, more specific, more insidious, and in some ways more operationally catastrophic. Forward listening posts, positioned sometimes only 40 or 50 meters from enemy lines, required their occupants to remain motionless and alert for shifts of up to 12 hours. Their function was to detect, through sound alone, the activity on the other side of no man's land, the movement of men, the positioning of guns, the digging of tunnels. The information they gathered was fed back to artillery batteries which would then attempt to suppress enemy positions before they became operational. It was, in principle, a highly effective system. In practice, it was destroying the men assigned to it with extraordinary efficiency. The acoustic environment of the Western Front by 1916 was unlike anything in human experience. A large artillery barrage could produce sustained noise in excess of 180 decibels at close range, considerably louder than a jet engine heard from 3 meters away. Men returned from listening post duties with tinnitus so severe that they could no longer function. Others reported being unable to distinguish between incoming and outgoing fire, a failure of auditory discrimination that, in practical terms, meant they could not do their jobs. The British medical establishment noted that the men most severely affected were often, paradoxically, those with the best pre-war hearing, because their auditory systems were more finely calibrated and therefore more violently disrupted. The Army needed men who could occupy forward listening positions and perform the associated observation and signal tasks without being driven to incapacity by the constant acoustic assault. It needed men whose psychological stability in the forward positions would not be compromised by the noise. And it needed, critically, men who could operate certain specialized pieces of equipment, vibration detection apparatus, ground microphones, and the first generation of seismic sensing devices being developed by the Royal Engineers, for which normal hearing was not only unnecessary, but was, in at least one documented instance, an active hindrance. The answer, when someone finally thought to say it out loud, was obvious. Find men who cannot hear. Give them the equipment that does not require hearing to operate. Put them in the positions where their insensibility to noise is not a disadvantage, but an armor. The unit that emerged from these discussions was designated, with the Army's characteristic gift for uninformative nomenclature as a specialist section attached to the Royal Engineers Signals establishment. No single name for the unit appears consistently across the surviving records, which is itself suggestive. Units whose existence is operationally sensitive tend to acquire multiple designations across different sets of paperwork, a practice that makes archival reconstruction difficult and was almost certainly intentional. What is consistent across the documents that have been released and across the accounts gathered by historians in the decades following the war is the nature of the men recruited and the equipment they were trained to use. Recruitment proceeded through a network of institutions that had, at the outbreak of war, seemed entirely peripheral to the military effort. The Royal National Institute for the Deaf, then operating under a slightly different name, was approached, along with several of the residential schools for deaf children that had been established across Britain during the latter half of the 19th century. The men sought were those who had been profoundly deaf from birth or early childhood, who had therefore never developed the neural pathways associated with auditory processing in the way that hearing individuals do, and who, crucially, had in many cases developed compensatory sensory acuity in other areas, particularly in their sensitivity to vibration. This last quality was not an assumption. It had been observed repeatedly in schools for the deaf throughout the 19th century that pupils without hearing frequently developed what contemporary accounts described as an almost uncanny sensitivity to vibration conducted through solid surfaces. Deaf children who could not hear music could nonetheless feel it through the floorboards. Men who had been deaf since childhood could detect the approach of heavy vehicles through the soles of their feet, with a reliability that hearing men found difficult to match. The neurological basis for this phenomenon, cortical reorganization in the auditory processing regions of the brain, which are recruited for enhanced processing of tactile and vibrational input in congenitally deaf individuals, was not understood in 1917 in anything like these terms. But the phenomenon itself was well documented, and it was precisely what the Royal Engineers needed. The equipment the men would operate was the ground microphone, a device developed primarily by the British and French armies in response to the threat of German mining operations. In its basic form, a ground microphone consisted of a sensor element, either a liquid-filled chamber or a mechanical diaphragm, pressed against the earth or against the timber of a trench wall, connected by a tube or wire to a listening apparatus. The device was extraordinarily sensitive. Placed correctly in a forward trench, a well-calibrated ground microphone could detect the sound of picks working underground at a distance of 40 meters or more through saturated French clay. It could register the vibration of men walking in a tunnel. In the hands of an experienced operator, it could give a reasonably accurate estimate of the depth and direction of an enemy mining effort. The problem with ground microphones in standard use was that they were almost unusable during active bombardment. The same sensitivity that allowed them to detect a pickaxe 40 meters away also picked up every shell impact, every vehicle on the road behind the lines, every footstep in the trench. Trained hearing operators working with the device reported that the acoustic noise during bombardment rendered it functionally blind. The signal they were trying to detect was buried under layers of irrelevant input that their auditory systems simply could not filter. The deaf operators had no such problem. They were not listening to the ground microphone. They were feeling it. Connected to the device through a modified interface that conveyed vibration directly to the fingertips and through the bones of the hand and wrist, rather than to the ears, a deaf operator experienced the acoustic environment of the ground in a completely different register. The shells that paralyzed hearing operators were, to them, simply not there. What remained? The lower frequency vibrations transmitted through solid earth over longer distances, the mechanical signature of a man working with a pick in a tunnel, the groan of timber under load, was not masked but actually clarified by the removal of the higher frequency acoustic noise. The men were typically grouped in pairs or small teams, working in rotating shifts of 2 to 4 hours due to the concentration required and the physical fatigue of sustained vibration monitoring. Communication within teams was conducted in British Sign Language or, in some documented cases, in bespoke tactical sign systems developed within the unit. Communication back to command was handled through written notes passed by runner, through signal lamp, or in later operations through a hearing liaison officer who would receive written information from the team and relay it verbally. Production figures for the specific equipment variants used by these men have not been fully declassified, though the broader ground microphone program across British and Allied forces is known to have produced several thousand units of various types by the end of the war. The operational record of the unit is, by necessity, fragmentary. The nature of forward-listening work meant that the men involved rarely left detailed accounts. Their function was to gather information and pass it back, not to document their own experience, and the institutional apparatus that might have preserved their stories was more interested in the intelligence product than in the human beings who produced it. What survives, in the form of Royal Engineers Unit diaries, medical records, and the accounts gathered by researchers at the Imperial War Museum in subsequent decades, suggests a pattern of deployment that concentrated the unit's activities in the Ypres salient and along the Somme sector, where German mining activity was most intense and most damaging to Allied positions. The Battle of Messines in June 1917, famous for the detonation of 19 enormous mines beneath German positions in what was at the time the largest planned explosion in human history, was preceded by months of subterranean listening work. The extent to which the deaf section contributed to the intelligence picture that allowed British mining engineers to locate and in some cases neutralize German countermines is not precisely documented, but former Royal Engineers officers interviewed in the 1960s and 1970s consistently reference the value of specialized vibration operators in the Messines preparation. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The psychological accounts of the men who served are perhaps the most striking element of the surviving record. Hearing soldiers who served in or alongside forward listening post almost universally described the experience as one of the most psychologically demanding of their service. The combination of extreme danger, enforced immobility, and sustained acoustic assault produced, in many cases, lasting damage. The deaf operators, by contrast, described the work in terms that, filtered through the sign language interpretation and written translation that characterized their communications with medical officers, suggest a different quality of experience. They were aware of danger. They understood the shells. They felt the impacts through the ground beneath them. But they did not experience the particular psychological dissolution that came from having the acoustic environment overwhelm the nervous system. They were, in a sense, already insulated against the weapon that was most effectively destroying the minds of the men around them. One account, preserved in a collection of papers held at a regimental archive and first brought to wider attention by the historian John Keegan's research in the 1970s, describes a deaf operator who remained at his post through a sustained German barrage that drove every other man in the trench below ground or to the breaking point. When the barrage lifted and his hearing comrades emerged, shaking and deafened, they found him still at his instrument, having detected and logged the preliminary vibrations of a German mining effort that had begun under cover of the bombardment. The information he had gathered allowed a British countermining operation to be initiated within hours. The German mine was never detonated. The records do not give his name. They rarely did. The German army, it is worth noting, was not entirely unaware of the problem that the British were attempting to solve, though their approach to it differed substantially. German listening operations in the First World War relied primarily on the geophone, a highly refined ground microphone developed by the German engineering establishment and considered, at the time, technically superior in pure sensitivity to most British equivalents. The geophone used a liquid membrane system that could detect vibrations of remarkable faintness, and German tunnel engineers were trained to its use with considerable thoroughness. What the German system did not attempt, as far as the surviving record indicates, was the systematic recruitment of operators whose existing sensory profile made them better suited to the device. The Germans trained hearing men to use the geophone and appear to have relied on technical refinement of the instrument itself to solve the problem of noise interference. The American Expeditionary Forces, arriving in 1917 and 1918 with considerable enthusiasm and rather less relevant experience, developed their own listening section based partly on information shared by British and French advisors. American accounts mention the British deaf section with varying degrees of detail. Some are quite specific about the tactical rationale, others appear either unaware of the program or constrained from discussing it. The French, who had been dealing with the mining threat longer than either the British or Americans, had by some accounts experimented independently with the recruitment of operators with hearing loss, though the systematic character of the British program appears to have been without close parallel. The British approach, using human neurological difference as a tactical advantage rather than attempting to engineer around it, represented in retrospect a conceptual breakthrough that the technology of the time was not equipped to fully exploit. A modern signals analyst looking at the program with knowledge of neuroplasticity and cortical reorganization would recognize immediately what the 1917 War Office was groping towards. The idea that the processing architecture of an individual human brain could be, in specific contexts, more capable than a nominally normal one. It is an idea that has taken the better part of a century to become mainstream. The unit was stood down in 1919, along with the vast majority of the wartime Army's specialist formations. The men returned, if they returned, to the deaf communities from which they had come. There was no campaign medal specific to their service, no distinctive insignia, no formal recognition that distinguished their contribution from that of the broader Royal Engineers establishment in which they were embedded. Some received the standard campaign medals that came with their service. Several are known to have been commended for specific actions, though the citations are sparse on operational detail for reasons that require little explanation. The precise impact of the program on the outcome of the war is, honestly, impossible to calculate. The intelligence gathered by listening operations of all kinds contributed to the counter-battery and counter-mining effort that was itself one component of a vast and complex military system. Isolating the contribution of any single element is the kind of historical exercise that produces confident figures that the evidence cannot actually support, and this history will not pretend otherwise. What can be said is this. At a moment when the British Army was systematically destroying the hearing of thousands of men by deploying them in roles for which normal hearing was an active disadvantage, a small group of individuals who had never had hearing at all were performing those same roles with greater stability, greater endurance, and in at least some documented cases greater effectiveness. The men that the pre-war world had considered, at best, objects of charitable concern and, at worst, simply less than whole, turned out to possess exactly the capability that the most sophisticated industrial war in human history required. The Imperial War Museum in London holds some of the surviving equipment from the listening sections of the First World War, including examples of ground microphone apparatus. The records relating to the deaf section are distributed across several archives, including the National Archives at Kew, and remain incompletely catalogued. Some documents are still subject to retention restrictions, though the operational security rationale for this a century on is not immediately obvious. Return, then, to that trench in the autumn of 1917. The barrage has been falling for 6 hours. The men who can hear have pressed themselves as flat as the earth allows, hands over their ears, because the choice between compliance and madness is no choice at all. The noise is not merely loud, it is total. It reorganizes the interior of a man's skull. It makes thought impossible and fear absolute. And there, at the forward end of the trench, crouched over a device that looks like something between a scientific instrument and a plumber's fitting, is a man who hears none of it. He is not brave in the way the military manuals describe bravery. He is not conquering fear, because the specific fear that has unmanned everyone around him does not exist in his world. What he has, instead, is something quieter and more precise, an attention so finely tuned to the information coming through his fingertips that the convulsions of the earth above him are simply background. He is not ignoring the war. He is receiving a different channel of it. Somewhere below him, 40 meters down through saturated clay, a German engineer is working a pick at a junction in a tunnel network, and this man can feel it. He feels the rhythm of the strikes. He counts them, not by ear but by pulse, each impact arriving as a pressure wave through the handle of the instrument, through the bones of his palm, up through his wrist and forearm and into a brain that has been routing itself around the silence since childhood and has found, in that rerouting, something extraordinary. He can, in this moment, do something that no hearing man in this trench can do. He can work. He writes 3 numbers on a slip of paper: bearing, depth, rate. He folds it and passes it to the man crouched behind him, who takes it without a word. There are no words between them that the noise would permit anyway, and begins to make his way back along the trench. The information will reach the countermining officer within the hour. By tomorrow morning, a British mining crew will be cutting a lateral tunnel toward the German position. Within a week, depending on the ground conditions, the German mine will either be destroyed before it can be fired or neutralized by the flooding of its gallery. The infantrymen in the sector will never know how close they came. They will never know who told the engineers where to dig. He was deaf. That was the point. That was always the point. In a war defined by the industrial manufacture of noise, the men who could not hear it were, for a specific and vital purpose, the most capable soldiers on the line. The British Army stumbled toward this conclusion by a combination of desperation and bureaucratic imagination, deployed it with the quiet pragmatism that characterizes British military improvisation at its best, and then, with equal pragmatism, forgot about it. The men did not forget. They went home to their communities, to their schools, to their families, carrying the knowledge of what they had done and the reasonable expectation, entirely justified by subsequent events, that no one would think to ask. The histories of the First World War are full of the voices of the men who survived it, recorded in memoirs and interviews and the extraordinary oral history programs that began in the 1970s. The men of the deaf section left fewer voices in the archive. They left vibrations in the clay instead. Some things, it turns out, are better felt than heard.